Jack Legs Diamond is seldom remembered today, but at his pinnacle, he rivaled Al Capone as the most famous gangster in Prohibition-era America. Whereas Capone was famous for being the CEO of the Chicago outfit, the largest criminal enterprise in the United States, Diamond was famous for getting shot, beating court cases, and carrying on a highly publicised extramarital affair with his showgirl mistress. In 1931 alone, Diamond appeared in the New York Times on 103 occasions. 19 of those appearances were on the front page. At the height of this fame, he received upwards of 100 fan letters a day, and the movie studio MGM had even considered making a film on his life. Perhaps his meteoric rise to stardom had something to do with the fact that Legs Diamond had survived 5 assassination attempts throughout his life, which would have put an end to the average man, but miraculously, Legs survived them all, and these assassins were no amateurs. The bloodthirsty rivals who were dispensing the lead in Diamond's direction were seasoned, experienced, cold-blooded killers who were usually the most trusted hitmen in Dutch Schultz's entourage. Diamond's once pal turned bitter enemy throughout his life. This led the press to dub Diamond as the clay pigeon of the underworld, and in 1930 drove Dutch Schultz to remark to his own gang that, "Geez, ain't there nobody that can shoot this guy so that he don't bounce back?" This is the story of how a petty thief born to Irish immigrants in Philadelphia became the biggest bootlegger in Manhattan, the most famous gangster in America, and seemingly danced his way through a barrage of gunfire on the way up. This is the story of Jack Legs Diamond. Legs Diamond was born John Thomas Diamond on July the 11th, 1898 in Kensington, Philadelphia, a popular destination for Irish immigrants towards the end of the 19th century, of which John's parents, Sarah and John Diamond, were. They had followed suit and moved over to the Promised Land 2 years before in 1896 from Dublin, as many of the Irish did. With Ireland still recovering from the Great Famine 40 years earlier and the lack of employment still rife, they decided to jump ship and sail on one from Southampton, and 5 days later they disembarked at Ellis Island, the busiest immigrant inspection and processing station in the United States in the late 19th century. Once they were through the invasive and animal-like inspection delivered by the guards of Ellis Island, most Irish immigrants headed to New York, which was the closest city to the port. Along with a heart full of dreams manufactured by the newspaper adverts back home, urging them to sail to the United States and bathe in the untold riches it would magically provide for you as soon as you made it through Ellis Island, usually the immigrants stepping foot off the boat had a bag of clothes and nothing else. They would have often saved up for years to obtain their fare to sail to the Promised Land, and that was their life savings exhausted. However, John and Sarah bypassed New York, opting to settle in Philadelphia, a city that was booming with jobs in the textile industry, and with John being a machinist in his native Dublin, he quickly obtained employment as a glass packer. 5 months after arriving in the United States, on June the 17th, 1896, John Diamond and Sarah Hart exchanged wedding vows and were married at St. Anne's Church in Kensington, their local church of which they were parishioners of and used to attend each Sunday, and the two Irish immigrants had quickly embedded themselves as a pivotal and respected couple in the Kensington area. Towards the end of 1897, Sarah fell pregnant, and the following summer, John Thomas Diamond was born at 2628 Lehigh Avenue in Philadelphia. John would be nicknamed Jack from birth to avoid confusion with his father, whose family would also sail over from Dublin 6 months after Jack was born and also gain employment at John's factory and move in with the Diamonds, who, with a house full of employed people, were not hurting for cash. Almost 4 years to the day that Jack took his first breath, John and Sarah welcomed another son into the world on July the 9th, 1902, and called him Edward. As the young couple settled into early 19th century Philadelphia, which was an era of horse-drawn carriages, oil lamps and whiskey readily available over the counter for all types of illnesses, they couldn't have conceived a world of expensive cars, Thompson submachine guns and national prohibition, but this would be a reality for their children. Jack attended school at St. Anne's, in which he obtained his pass through his parents, who were clean-hearted, respectable, church-going people and wanted to bring their child up to reflect their morals and beliefs. However, they quickly learned that Jack perhaps had Satan inside him, and no amount of holy water or prayers would banish his demons. Despite showing a genuine interest and passion in poetry, especially the works of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Jack was not a very good student and had no intention of conforming to any Catholic ways or virtues. However, due to his parents' contributions to the community, the school decided to allow Jack to continue in his class despite the vast amount of trouble he caused, usually stealing from fellow pupils and teachers. As his cousin Richard Diamond would put it years later, Jack was light-fingered, couldn't resist stealing things. Shop owners in a 2-mile radius of Jack would glue everything down. The family doctor said an operation would cure it, but Sarah wouldn't let them operate. Jack's behaviour really began to spiral out of control as he approached his 8th birthday, when his life was shattered. Like most good Irish Catholic families of the day, John and Sarah continued to expand their family, and another son, Thomas, was born on August the 31st, 1904. 11 months went by before Sarah again fell pregnant in 1905, but sadly the pregnancy was overcast by tragedy. At 1.5 years of age, Thomas developed acute bronchitis, which later developed into pneumonia, and the toddler passed away in February 1906. About 3 months later, Sarah gave birth to a girl they called Margaret. Like her brother Thomas, her time on earth would be tragically cut short, and she passed away in 1907. A few months after Margaret's death, Sarah also contracted tuberculosis, and in June 1907, Sarah too succumbed to illness. In a mere 15 months, half of the Diamond family were buried in the graveyard of St. Anne's Church, and the remaining family, Jack, Eddie and John, were absolutely decimated. The seeds of Jack's criminality were planted as a young child, whilst his mother was still alive, but she was able to keep him in check, as he would still attend school and church at her request. However, after her passing, he began spending less and less time in each. A few months after his mother's death, Jack was sent to a Catholic protectory in Philadelphia because of delinquency, mainly stealing. He lasted all of 5 weeks in the Catholic protectory before he escaped and headed back to Kensington, where he rejoined his class in St. Anne's. Typically, Jack quickly became bored with school, as again didn't hold much interest for him, and began hanging out with other truants from St. Anne's in a nearby junkyard, where they would climb into the lot's many boilers that lay about rusting away. This led to them being called the Boiler Gang, and this group of local menaces began stealing and terrorising the local community instead of attending school. By 1910, the surviving Diamonds were living in a boarding house. John was still employed as a glass packer, but had turned to the bottle and neglected Jack and Eddie, who were now 12 and 8. Realising that Jack wasn't interested in school, John obtained him a job at a spinning mill, but Jack's lack of respect towards authority got him sacked after just 1 week. John then got his son a job in a textile mill, which didn't work out either after he was caught stealing fabric. At his wit's end, John sent the boys to live with their Aunt Annie, John's sister, in Manhattan, hoping that the law of the Big Apple would help get Jack on the right path. Little did he know it would actually do the opposite. In New York, Jack quickly fell in with the local teenage street gang, the Hudson Dusters, who were headed by notorious career criminal Frank Goo Goo Knox. The gang operated from an apartment house on Hudson Street and had controlled most of Manhattan's west side, including the waterfront, since the 1890s. This was Jack's first introduction to real organised crime. He excelled through the ranks of the Hudson Dusters, helping wipe out rival gangs so the Dusters could expand their territory, and particularly excelled in burglary, a craft he had been mastering since a young child. For the next 4 years, Jack would prove to be a crucial member of the Hudson Dusters in their ongoing street war with rival gang the Gophers, headed up by fellow Irishman Augie the Killer Madden. The two outfits were at war over control of the Hudson River docks, and this war escalated from petty teenage street gang bust-ups to ruthless murder in 1914, as Augie Madden was shot 6 times outside the Arbor Dance Hall, but miraculously survived. This resulted in Madden and the Gophers going on an all-out rampage, resulting in the deaths of 5 members of the Hudson Dusters over the next 3 days. Jack realised that the Dusters were going to lose the war and quickly left the gang, distancing himself from Hudson Street and relocating to the Bowery, where he would be nicked for his first arrest. In December 1914, Jack and 2 associates were passing the Strauss jewellery store in Brooklyn and noticed gold chains and rings on display in the window. Jack ordered one of his associates to smash the window with a brick whilst he grabbed the loot, and they ran. A nearby cop heard the glass shatter and gave chase, but they outran him and returned to Manhattan. Back on the Bowery, local police officer Herman Schultz was walking his beat when he noticed the 3 young men loitering outside a pawn shop. As he approached the teens, they scurried away up the street. With his curiosity aroused, he entered the pawn shop and asked the shopkeeper what had happened, who explained that Jack had offered to sell him some gold chains, but the shopkeeper had refused, as the chains looked brand new and they were probably stolen. Schultz exited the shop and chased the 3 hoodlums into another store, where he cornered them and took them back to Clinton Street Police Station, which is where they were searched. The chains were found, as well as a significant amount of cash, and after some grueling tactics from the police, the threesome admitted to stealing the chains from the Strauss jewellery store, and they were sent off to Blackwell's Island Penitentiary. Built in 1832 because the treacherous tides of the East River would make escape almost impossible, it was the Alcatraz of its day. It later became known as Welfare Island, and today we know it as Roosevelt Island. Blackwell's Island Penitentiary was specifically built for first-time offenders. Officials felt that if these non-professional, embryonic hoodlums were separated from hardened and experienced criminals serving time in the city's other prisons, they would have a better shot at rehabilitation, but conditions on the island were no secret. Away from the eyes of the city, the guards in control were sadistic and had numerous vicious and brutal tactics to keep their teenage inmates in check. Torture from those in charge was a daily occurrence at Blackwell's Island, and with Jack having no respect and a genuine hatred for authority, he would have endured many of the abusive punishments, including the stand-up, where every night for 2 weeks the prisoner had to stand on a line from 8 PM until 11 AM, when they were now allowed to sleep until 2 AM in the morning, and had to then again stand on the line until 6 AM, when they would spend their entire day in the workhouse. Jack spent his fair share of time in solitary confinement as well, or the cooler as they called it on the island, where he would only be given 1 glass of water and 2 slices of bread a day, whilst also being forced to kneel for at least 4 hours a day, and any time he leant over, he was beaten with a billy club. The prison was eventually shut down once the tales of this severe prisoner abuse made it back across the East River and to the officials of New York. Jack was released from this hellhole in 1916, 17 months after arriving, and obviously his time spent incarcerated had the opposite of the desired effect, and upon his release, he had absolutely no plans of going straight. Jack headed back to Manhattan, suitably hardened and even more bitter after his stint at Blackwell's Island, and he quickly became involved with a gang of thieves headed by William Baron Bean Butler, and over the next 6 months racked up a number of arrests for robbery and grand larceny. But never having enough evidence, the police had no other option but to release him every time. After 6 months of thieving his way around New York to survive, uncharacteristically, on June the 28th, 1916, Jack joined the New York National Guard. Whether he'd had enough of petty crime and wanted to straighten his life out is unknown, but a week after signing up, he was arrested for third-degree assault, and perhaps he knew the arrest was coming and joined the Guard because he was trying to impress a judge or get out of serving any more dreaded jail time. Either way, the ploy worked and he was acquitted on July the 14th, 3 days after his 18th birthday, and ready to embark on his military career. Jack reported for duty a year later on July the 15th, 1917, as a member of the 20th Company in the 9th Regiment Coast Artillery, and, predictably, took to military life like a cat to water. After going AWOL from the army 3 times in 2 years, he was eventually convicted and jailed for deserting in 1919 and sentenced to 5 years in Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas. Conditions at Leavenworth were significantly better than his time at Blackwell's Island, and he sailed through his jail time, being released after serving only 2 years. In March 1921, Jack returned to New York a free man, free from the military prison at Leavenworth, free from the military itself, and now he was free to begin, along with his brother Eddie, who had also moved to Manhattan, his ascent to the upper echelons of New York's underworld. During Jack's incarceration, New York and the United States had changed. The 18th Amendment had been passed in January 1920, which prohibited the sale, production and transport of alcohol. This was also known as Prohibition. This was music to Jack's ears, as before Prohibition he'd relied on burglary to make ends meet. He now had a nation who desperately wanted a drop of the good stuff and had nowhere to get it, or so it seemed. Speakeasies began cropping up all over New York where you could get a drink quietly without the police or specialised prohibition agents knowing. In fact, it's estimated that there were over 32,000 speakeasies in New York alone during the height of Prohibition, and Jack and Eddie Diamond quite fancied a slice of those profits. Jack didn't have the patience initially to start his own bootlegging operation from the ground up, and as a thief, he wasn't initially in the business of bootlegging, aka the buying, selling and distribution of booze. He simply stole from others. His first venture into hijacking bootleggers came in the autumn of 1921. On September the 24th, 56-year-old small-time bootlegger John Gorman was preparing to leave his Bronx home at 1442 Commonwealth Avenue. He made sure to double-check he had locked his cellar door, as he had some extremely valuable goods stored there, namely in the way of 58 cases of Irish whiskey, 3 barrels of port and 3 barrels of sherry, amounting to around $8,000, about $140,000 today. Once Gorman left, Jack and Eddie, accompanied by 5 other associates, broke into the cellar and lifted the spirits. A neighbour of Gorman's witnessed the theft and told him. He knew by the neighbour's description that the theft was carried out by the Diamond brothers and went straight to the police, where a warrant was swiftly put out for Jack's arrest. 2 days later, Jack was picked up in the Bronx for the Gorman robbery and pleaded not guilty, being released on a $2,500 bail. A court date was set for November, which Jack failed to show for, and the bail was forfeited. He managed to avoid the law and court for a further 2 years before finally having to answer for the Gorman theft, and when the time came, the case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence to convict the defendant. Jack's acquittal made the newspapers due to the unusual fact that this was a thief stealing from a bootlegger, and the Diamond Gang received their first, but certainly not their last, piece of coverage in the New York newspapers. As the 1920s began to roar, Jack and Eddie began further developing a name for themselves in the New York underworld. They formed a professional robbery gang which specialised in hitting lofts, stores and warehouses. Anywhere whiskey, furs, silks or jewellery was stored, they would break into and pillage, and they elevated themselves into one of the more respected gangs in town. Their exploits during the early years of Prohibition are when they would attract the attention of Arnold Rothstein, and the opportunity that Jack would seize to transform himself from petty crook to a major player in the underworld. Arnold Rothstein was universally known as Big Bankroll, and quite simply was the money and brains behind most of New York City's underworld activities. AR, as he was known by his colleagues, began the century as a gambler, and as his bank account grew, so did his position in the criminal world. By the start of Prohibition, Rothstein was on a mission to transform organised crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a business run like a corporation, and had gained notoriety as the first person who realised that Prohibition was a business opportunity, an untapped money-making scheme with limitless potential for crime bosses like himself to make a fortune. His enormous wealth made him the go-to guy for any enterprising young hood with a good idea but without sufficient capital to see it through, and he quickly became the mentor of many budding criminals including Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Bugsy Siegel and our man Legs Diamond. Rothstein could act as the face of organised crime, whilst his band of merry men could do the dirty work and keep the whiskey and beer flowing in the thirsty streets of New York City. He became the go-between for gangsters and the politicians, dubbing himself as Mr. Fix-It. Rothstein could act as a fence, help out with labour disputes and assist in getting the right candidate elected. In the 1920s, if it was illegal and could make him money, he probably had his fingers in it. Learning of the loot the diamonds had been snatching in the early 1920s, Rothstein reached out to Jack and explained that he could act as a fence for their spoils, finding a suitable buyer for anything they stole, and Jack and AR began working closely together in early 1922, forming a blossoming and lucrative partnership. When Rothstein was acting as the mediator in a strike at a cloak and suit factory, which he was having problems with and had promised to sort out for a friend at Tammany Hall, the executive committee of the Democratic Party in New York City, he asked the Diamond Brothers to help him out. They paid the striking employees a visit at their factory and settled the labour dispute with intimidation and violence. AR was impressed and personally hired Jack as his bodyguard and cut him in on more of his enterprise. In 1923, Rothstein was undoubtedly the biggest importer of liquor in New York, and offering them more money than they were receiving for their thieving activities, Jack and Eddie began working for him, protecting his shipments which were susceptible to being hijacked by rival bootleggers, which tingled the natural thief senses in Jack's brain and gave him an idea. Jack approached AR and explained that rather than buying the liquor, usually from just across the Canadian border, it would be much easier and much cheaper to just steal it, as he had done in the case of John Gorman, from other bootleggers. He proposed to Rothstein that if he funded the diamonds with a few trucks and a drop-off point, they would be able to provide him with discounted liquor. The thought of cheap booze appealed to Rothstein, and he quickly set the brothers up with the means to begin their own operation, and soon Jack and Eddie were hijacking liquor shipments meant for others. Around the same time the brothers began hijacking shipments, Jack had hijacked the heart of Bronx-born Alice Kenny, and the pair were married in 1923. Described once in the New York Times as a crass, nagging, beer-guzzling ignoramus who curses like a mule driver, Alice was the gun moll that Jack was looking for. She could hold her own, standing at 5'9", and kitted herself out in the finest rings, bracelets and necklaces, usually recently lifted from a new husband, and would never be seen without a whiskey in hand in the speakeasies of New York, constantly praising and complimenting Jack whenever anyone engaged in conversation with her. Towards the end of 1923, the Diamond Brothers had begun making enemies in the New York underworld with their hijacking exploits, but they were thoroughly protected by Rothstein, who ran the show. They had participated in many shootouts during these hijackings, and this is where Jack acquired his nickname of Legs, due to how fast he could escape his enemies once the booze had been stolen, and his new nickname made for great headlines, attracting even more readers to the newest face of organised crime, Legs Diamond. However, on one particular night, Legs Diamond wasn't too quick. Whilst unloading a hijacked truck in one of his lockups in Manhattan, two men armed with shotguns walked into the warehouse, ignored the other three members of his gang helping to unload, and specifically targeted Jack, unloading their shotguns in his direction. Jack collapsed to the floor and the gunmen scarpered once Jack's associates began returning fire. It's unknown which rival crime faction sent the men to murder Jack, as he had ripped off so many rival bootleggers. There was a whole host of enemies who wanted him dead. Unfortunately for the said enemies, however, Jack made a full recovery and was back in business within 2 weeks. This was the first of many assassination attempts that Legs Diamond would endure throughout his life. For the next couple of years, the Diamond brothers propelled themselves into New York stardom and fame. They were regularly seen with large bankrolls like their boss Rothstein in the bars and clubs of Manhattan, and they regularly featured in the papers, and it was no secret that Jack enjoyed this coverage from the press. However, it became quite clear that all this attention had gone to Jack's head, and he began feeling invincible, quickly beginning to branch out from hijacking minor bootleggers' shipments to hijacking shipments belonging to more feared and respected mobsters. Had Jack stuck with ripping off small-time bootleggers like John Gorman, Jack would have been okay. But his uncontrollable attraction for big scores and fearlessness of consequences led to trouble with some formidable gangsters in New York at this time, namely Big Bill Dwyer, who along with his partner Frank Costello was one of Manhattan's biggest bootleggers. At first, nothing was done about Jack, as Dwyer didn't want to engage in a beer war with Rothstein and his proteges, of which his partner Frank Costello had been one once upon a time. But after a few more high-valued shipments mysteriously disappeared, Big Bill Dwyer and Frank Costello quit worrying about Rothstein and sent out a pack of bloodthirsty killers on the hunt for Jack. The second attempt on Jack's life came just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July the 1st, 1925, as Jack was driving up 5th Avenue in Manhattan. When he arrived at 106th Street, a sedan full of Italian gunmen, associates of Frank Costello, pulled up alongside him, armed with a shotgun and 2 pistols. There was a quick explosion as 64 shotgun pellets peppered Jack's head and body, and a .45 bullet clipped his heel, and the sedan sped off. Luckily for Jack, there was a hospital located on 106th Street, and staff who heard the shooting ran out and found him unconscious. They turned off his car and carried him inside for treatment, where he fully recovered after only 1 night in the hospital. Detectives were called before he was to be discharged, and when they asked Jack who was behind the shooting, he simply replied, "Greasers." Perhaps as retaliation for his smart reply, the detectives arrested Jack for carrying a gun, but that was the least of his worries. This close shave with death had made it clear to Jack that he needed to be more selective with the shipments he was planning to steal, and apparently the buckshot knocked some sense into his fearless mind, because he instantly stopped ripping off Dwyer and Costello's shipments, while simultaneously his boss Rothstein worked out a deal that in exchange for Jack to stop stealing their shipments, Dwyer and Costello would stop trying to murder him, and he was free to walk the streets of Manhattan again. As bootlegging became the desired profession of many budding criminals in New York, Rothstein was not satisfied with being one of many bootleggers in town and began to fade out of rum running. It was becoming a crowded and increasingly violent industry which had slipped out of his control, and if he couldn't be in control, he didn't want to be involved. Plus, there was a more lucrative, embryonic and appealing racket that Rothstein was dabbling in: narcotics. Towards the end of 1925, Rothstein had switched his position as the biggest importer of liquor in the US to the biggest importer of drugs. He had set up a dummy corporation in Amsterdam and sent one of his main men, George Uffner, with bucket loads of cash to act as a buyer to the legitimate pharmaceutical companies in Europe to buy mass quantities of heroin, cocaine and morphine. Rothstein must have seen something he really liked in Jack, because after the attempt on his life, he convinced Diamond to stay away from hijacking booze shipments and join his drug cartel, where he could make untold fortunes which would dwarf his returns in the hijacking and bootlegging business, and was much less dangerous at the same time, to which Jack obviously accepted. Rothstein sent Jack to Europe to manage some deals with the pharmaceutical companies in December 1925, which proved successful. Jack's natural charisma, charm and conversational skills helped get many of the deals over the line, something that street thug George Uffner lacked in. Jack sailed back on the SS Berengaria and arrived back in New York on December the 29th, 1925, and was met with a bonus of $100,000 from Rothstein, around $2 million in today's money, for securing the deals, and wasted no time in spending his fortunes. Every successful and self-respecting Prohibition-era gangster had a headquarters, usually a speakeasy, and Diamond was no different. A natural show-off, Diamond's watering hole was known as the Bronx Theatrical Club, located on the second floor of 378 East 149th Street. It consisted of 3 rooms which were luxuriously furnished with $25,000 worth of wall tapestries, no doubt ones he had lifted in his pre-heroin robbery days. It was the absolute picture of grandeur, with dazzling hand-painted artwork acquired by Jack on his travels in Europe, gold-plated banisters, elaborate chandeliers, and not to mention the finest booze in New York to pour into the crystal glassware it was drunk out of. It was a far way from the unsophisticated fellow Bronx speakeasies where you would usually indulge on a dirty glass full of piss-weak needle beer that had been slid down the length of the bar at you in an abrupt manner. This was deliberate by Diamond. He wanted everyone to know in New York that he was one of the real kingpins in town now, and his speakeasy became a great success with the affluent locals, and also began attracting aspiring hoodlums who were rising through the ranks of the underworld and wanted to help run things for Diamond and his brother Eddie, and they began expanding their gang. One of Jack's employees at the club was a fellow Arnold Rothstein minion and local hoodlum Arthur Flegenheimer, who went by the moniker Dutch Schultz. Dutch had gained a reputation of ruthlessness and strict discipline whilst working in numerous other speakeasies, and now he wanted to be the security at the biggest and most deluxe establishment in the Bronx. In 1925, Dutch also managed to secure himself a deputy sheriff's badge, which made it lawful for him to carry a gun, another appealing trait to this ambitious hoodlum for Diamond to accept him into his ranks. Jack, Eddie and Dutch realised that the Bronx Theatrical Club would begin to attract attention from the local prohibition agents, with it being the most swankiest and respectable place to get an illegal sip of the good stuff in the city, and therefore they spent thousands on having an elaborate security system installed to thwart potential raids. The main door to the watering hole was constructed of thick oak wood, and beyond that was a solid iron gate which preceded a 2-foot thick metal door which could be controlled by the operator inside the club. Needless to say, the well-known security system deterred the prohibition agents from raiding the joint until March the 9th, 1926, when they had no other choice but to get inside. That morning, the neighbouring furniture factory was operational as usual, with the carpenters plying their trade. Next door at the club, the remaining patrons, who were still drinking to the early hours, were making their usual racket when suddenly a fight broke out, and during the melee, somebody pulled out a gun and fired a shot that pierced the wall and narrowly missed the head of one of the working carpenters. They ran out into the street to find the first patrolman they could, who called for backup, and, upon hearing this, a number of the speakeasy occupants started to escape by shimmying down the gutters. Expecting trouble from the police, the Diamond gang members who stayed, including the most ruthless and feared killer in the gang, Dutch Schultz, brought down steel shutters over the door and windows. Around 20 cops fell on the club, and a large crowd gathered to watch the action. Armed with axes and sledgehammers, they spent over an hour getting through the wooden door before spending another hour sawing off the bars of the iron gate. After another 2 hours hopelessly trying to cut through the 2-foot thick metal door, they decided to enter the furniture factory and started hacking through the wall, and eventually got through after 3 hours. On the other side, they were met with laughs from Dutch and the boys, who were having a drink inside the bar and enjoying their early morning entertainment. Dutch and another 7 members of the Diamond crew, including Peter Felice and Salvatore Spitale, who were tasked with looking after the club, were arrested and Dutch was forced to forfeit his deputy badge. After 9 days in jail, all those arrested were released and it was business as usual for the gang. The Bronx Theatrical Club was so successful that speakeasies all across the Bronx and Manhattan wanted to exclusively buy the product which was making the club such a hit. And thus, with Arnold Rothstein being knee-deep in dope, Jack began his rise to becoming the biggest bootlegger in Manhattan, providing whiskey, gin and beer to most of the watering holes, avoiding the watchful eye of the law in the Big Apple. The summer of 1926 found Jack making 2 more back-to-back trips to France to purchase heroin for Mr. Rothstein, of which he was doing a remarkable job. It was still early days, but slowly and surely the streets of New York were being introduced to heroin, which resulted in the bankrolls of both Jack and his boss AR significantly increasing. Although Jack's resume now read bootlegger, drug dealer and speakeasy proprietor, he still got his kicks from robbery and couldn't refuse a good loot when he was offered one. On December the 21st, 1926, a car was driving through Central Park containing Albert Levy, a wealthy insurance broker who was carrying $8,000 in his pocket, around $140,000 today. As his driver pulled out of the park and entered 105th Street, a sedan containing 4 gunmen pulled up behind them, and one of the gunmen fired 2 shots through the rear window. Glass fragments flew into Levy's head, and during the commotion, the gunmen descended on Levy and tried to get his money, but Levy put up a fight during the tussle and a crowd began to gather, which alarmed the gunmen, who jumped back in the sedan and sped off. In the hospital, Albert Levy identified his attackers as Jack Diamond, Eddie Diamond, Thomas Fats Walsh and Charles Lucky Luciano. 20 detectives were swiftly sent out and all 4 were arrested within the hour and brought to the hospital so that Levy could identify them. Once he was face to face with the gangsters, however, Levy got cold feet. "There's some mistake," he told the detectives. "These are not the men." It later transpired that Jack got a message to Levy through a corrupt cop that was guarding his bedside, explaining he would blow his head off if he ratted to the police about who tried to rob him. The threat and the man who issued it, Legs Diamond, wreaked fear into Levy's heart and he decided against it. It also later transpired that this failed robbery attempt was masterminded by Lucky Luciano, an underling of Arnold Rothstein who had been introduced to Jack a few weeks prior. By this point in his criminal career, Jack didn't need to be sticking up citizens with the amount of green that was flowing his way, but a sure $2,000 apiece for a few minutes' work was probably too hard to pass up for the natural-born thief. It's thought that Luciano had come to know Levy through Arnold Rothstein, with the two being associates, and Levy was the flashy type, constantly sporting a large bankroll of notes at meetings that Luciano attended. The victim knew all 4 of his assailants by name, and they knew that he was specifically carrying $8,000, a hugely significant amount of money at the time. Although the plan didn't materialise how they wanted it to, Luciano and Diamond became friends and continued their rise through the underworld together. Through Luciano, Diamond became acquainted with the Lower East Side's top mobster and New York City's top labour racketeer, Jacob Little Augie Organ, who had worked for Rothstein in the labour rackets, an area of work that Jack had also dabbled in for AR. Eddie began working as Little Augie's personal bodyguard, and Jack cut Little Augie into his bootlegging and drug dealing operations, expanding his territory into the Lower East Side, and in return, Little Augie cut Diamond in on some of the labour rackets, which annoyed Little Augie's top lieutenants, Louis Lepke Buckhalter and Jacob Garage Shapiro. Shapiro and Buckhalter began clashing with their boss, Little Augie, raising their concerns that Legs Diamond was a thief and now had his loose fingers in their labour racket pies. They also didn't like the fact that he wasn't Jewish and that he had risen to the same rank as Little Augie, while Shapiro and Buckhalter were still second in command. Little Augie told them to brush it off and that they'd be cut a profit from their new income streams of heroin and bootlegging, which wasn't possible without Jack being involved. A few months later, a Brooklyn union approached Little Augie and offered to pay handsomely for strong-arm men to fight strikebreakers, employees who continued working despite a strike. Instead of cutting Buchalter and Shapiro in on it, Little Augie decided to use Jack's mob for the job. His lieutenants caught wind of it, and Louis Lepke informed Augie that it was his strike and Diamond had no business being there, as his mob specialised in silk and fur robberies. Little Augie explained that this had dried up recently and the Diamond Gang needed to venture into more money-making schemes. In reality, the Diamond Gang were absolutely raking it in, as was Little Augie, who couldn't believe how much money he was making from bootlegging and dope, and wanted to keep Diamond and his gang sweet so that the money didn't dry up. Buchalter and Shapiro had decided that their boss had gone too far, and it was time for them to inherit the rackets and start running the show. Lepke and Garrar were aware that their soon-to-be former boss had a rendezvous with Jack planned for October the 15th, 1927 at 8 p.m. They also knew that Diamond and Little Augie would be meeting on the Lower East Side at the corner of Delancey and Norfolk streets, and they arranged to have a little welcoming party stationed for them. Just before 8 p.m, Jack and Augie arrived at the agreed location and exchanged greetings. Eddie, brother of Jack and Little Augie's bodyguard, was told to have the night off. They began to walk north towards Rivington Street when a dark sedan pulled out into traffic and slowly pulled up behind them. 3 armed men emerged from the car and walked up behind the duo. One of the gunmen put his pistol to the back of Little Augie's head and fired a bullet straight through the gang leader's brain. At the sound of gunfire, Jack instinctively turned around, producing his pistol, and the gunman directed his attention towards Jack, firing 2 bullets into his abdomen, leading him to collapse. Satisfied with the job they had carried out, the 3 gunmen lowered their guns, tilted their heads down, and calmly walked back to the car, which sped off. As the gun smoke ascended, Jack lifted himself off the sidewalk. A few feet away, face down in an ever-spreading pool of blood, Little Augie lay motionless. Jack was no stranger to being shot or the pain that followed once the initial adrenaline had worn off. This was the 3rd attempt on Jack's life in as many years, and he knew that before the said adrenaline wore off, he needed to get to the hospital, as the police would refrain from getting him treatment unless he gave them information, which he wouldn't, as he'd rather die than break the gangster code. Clutching his wounds, Jack staggered past the gobsmacked onlookers who were surprised he was even still alive, let alone able to walk, and stumbled 6 blocks to a nearby hospital. Around 20 minutes later, police arrived at the scene and Organ was pronounced dead, his body being taken to the police station and laid on the floor whilst the cops questioned the onlookers. Other than the fact that 4 men were involved in the shooting, they were unable to obtain anything else about the hit. Typically, Jack was no help either. He was transferred to Bellevue Hospital, and when police questioned him relentlessly, he stuck to the code and gave them nothing of value, explaining he had no idea about anyone who would want to do him or Little Augie any harm. Though Jack was no stranger to featuring in the papers, the murder of Little Augie gave him his first real moment in the spotlight, and he was now front page news. His nickname of Legs Diamond was printed all over the front pages of the New York newspapers, as he had played that nickname to a T during this latest assassination attempt, simply rising up off the sidewalk and walking off. As his fame increased, so did resentment towards him, not only from the police, but also from his own gang, who craved some of that spotlight, most notably his head of security at the Bronx Theatrical Club, Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz was born Arthur Flegenheimer in 1901 in the Bronx to Jewish German immigrants. He had made a name for himself in his teens as a rabble-rousing thief with a natural penchant for violence. After hustling none the wiser old-timers in Bronx bars, plying his trade as a successful pool shark, Schultz got himself nicked during the robbery of a Bronx apartment and sent to the dreaded Blackwell's Island, just as Jack had in his youth. He returned just as Jack did, suitably hardened and transitioned from Arthur Flegenheimer to Dutch Schultz. He was released from prison at the dawn of Prohibition, and Schultz went to work loading beer trucks for local bootleggers Jack and Otto Gass and helping out on the doors of their speakeasies, which is where he gained his reputation for violence and began working for Jack at the Bronx Theatrical Club. As Jack recuperated from the couple of bullets he came away with at the murder of Little Augie, Dutch Schultz and his partner, Joey Noy, decided that they didn't want to hang around for their boss to fully recover and to go into the bootlegging business on their own whilst their boss was out of action. Together, they opened up the Hub Social Club on Brook Avenue in the Bronx and began importing high-quality beer from New Jersey breweries, which went down a treat with the Bronx locals who couldn't afford the prices at the Bronx Theatrical Club and were usually drinking slop that a two-bit bootlegger had brewed in the basement of his tenement building. Success came quickly for Schultz and Noy, and soon they were muscling former employees like the Gas Brothers and the aforementioned two-bit bootleggers out of business with a formidable Bronx brigade of gunmen including Bo Weinberg, Mad Dog Col and his brother Peter, Larry Carney, Fatty Walsh, Joey Rayo and Fats McCarthy, to name a few. These bloodthirsty disciples of Schultz and Noy made their enterprise a force to be reckoned with, and a newspaper at the time was even quoted as referring to the Noy-Schultz outfit as the most ruthless in the city. You could take over a South American government with a band of killers like that. Once the Bronx was conquered, the Schultz-Noy entourage wanted to quench the thirst of the Manhattan crowd, a crowd whose thirst was already being quenched by their former boss, Jack, who was now back in action, supplying most of the speakeasies in Manhattan with all the illegal booze that they could wish for. Upon hearing the request from the Schultz-Noy gang to muscle into Manhattan, Jack showed the real deceitful nature which had aided his meteoric rise to being the biggest bootlegger in Manhattan. A deal had been made between the two parties where cash would be handed over from the Bronx gangsters to Jack and his outfit in exchange for territory, and that meeting was scheduled for October the 15th, 1928, exactly a year after Little Augie was put on the spot, at 7 in the morning at the Chateau Madrid on 54th Street, a favoured late-night brothel and watering hole of Dutch Schultz and Joey Noy's. The pair arrived around 5 AM and conducted business before Schultz left, leaving Noy and Jack to negotiate the money and territory. A short time later, at around 7:15 in the morning, the residents of West 54th Street were awoken by a roar of gunfire and had them rush into their windows to see a blue Cadillac speeding erratically away before their eyes focused on the sidewalk in front of the Chateau Madrid, where a man lay injured, desperately returning fire at the Cadillac, which had just hit a parked car and driven off. The man was Joey Noy. He had been ambushed and shot in his right breast, left hand and spine. All that remained on the scene with Joey was the door of the Cadillac, which had presumably fallen off when it hit the parked car. Joey was still alive, just. He was desperately wounded but coherent. Upon his person, the police found a sheriff's badge, which he must have acquired at the same time as Dutch a few years prior, allowing him to carry his gun. Rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, he denied knowing his assailant and explained he was just parking his car when two guys began shooting at him. Upon further questioning from the police, he snapped and explained, "I'll take care of it myself." The Dutchman was alerted and immediately visited his partner in hospital, where he was informed that Jack had double-crossed them. Within an hour of Dutch leaving Roosevelt Hospital, a blue Cadillac with a door missing containing the bullet-ridden body of Louis Weinberg was found on the Lower East Side. Louis Weinberg was an associate of Jack's, one that he had met during the Little Augie days. The police quickly established that this was the man who had exchanged gunfire with Joey Noy, and in fact, Joey did know his assailant. He was just waiting for his trusty right-hand man to turn up. They put two and two together and transferred Joey to the Bellevue Hospital prison ward unless he agreed to speak. After a few weeks, however, it was physically impossible for Joey to speak. The damage from the bullets had caused infection in his body, and he wasted away to 90 pounds before eventually succumbing to his injuries on November the 21st. Dutch Schultz was at his bedside the whole time. Schultz was cut up by the loss of his partner. Joey was the closest friend he ever had, and he had just been ripped from him. He was severely crushed, and it'd be a cold day in hell before the ruthless and murderous Schultz let Jack get away with putting an end to his partner. Jack was also well aware of the nature of Dutch, having previously employed him at the Bronx Theatrical Club, and he went into hiding. With the Bronx brigade of killers on every street corner in Manhattan waiting for Jack to pop his head out and fire 3 slugs into his brain, Jack was scared into reclusiveness and took a suite at the Hotel Monticello on West 64th Street with his wife, Alice. With the usually omnipresent kingpin nowhere to be seen, Schultz and his boys muscled in on Manhattan, eventually taking over the supply of all the speakeasies who were now buying from Dutch's entourage, and Jack's territory had now been absorbed. The bad news for Jack didn't stop there, as in November his pal and former boss Arnold Rothstein was murdered at the Park Central Hotel on 7th Avenue. It's widely believed that Rothstein was murdered over a gambling debt, but the chance that Dutch ordered the killing of AR in retaliation for the murder of Joey Noy, orchestrated by Diamond, is not out of the question. Either way, with the Dutchman wanting Jack's head on a stake to parade on Broadway, Jack could not attend his former boss's funeral and remained in hiding. To add insult to injury in what had been a rotten end of 1928 for Jack, his ever-loyal brother Eddie contracted the merciless illness which had killed his brother and sister 20 years prior, tuberculosis. Thinking country air would be better for Eddie than the industrial smog he was currently breathing in, and seeing that the Big Apple was not safe for either of them anymore, the brothers headed upstate. Jack scouted out the Catskill region and found a house in Accra, a small village near the town of Cairo, which they purchased and moved in on January the 8th, 1929. Less than 2 weeks after the purchase, Eddie went up to Saranac Lake, a town in the Adirondack Mountains that specialises in treating those suffering with tuberculosis, and was put under the care of the most expensive doctors. With Eddie under someone else's supervision, Jack began setting up his operation in Cairo. Knowing that his future endeavours would likely attract the attention of the police or rival bootleggers who could inform the bloodthirsty Dutch Schultz of his whereabouts, Jack didn't skimp out on the security of his new upstate home. Visitors first had to travel up a 200-foot driveway to get anywhere near the 2-storey abode located on over a half an acre of secluded land just off Route 23. Jack set up 2 spotlights to illuminate the front yard and driveway. The bases of the trees surrounding the house were painted white, so in the event of an attack, invaders wouldn't be able to use them as camouflage. 3 guard dogs roamed the land, as did his well-equipped and well-experienced crew, who also fancied an escape from the constant hunting from the Schultz gang and followed their boss to upstate New York. Jack's disciples were exactly the kind of men you would want if Dutch Schultz's band of Bronx murderers were trailing your scent. In Eddie's absence, who was suffering from tuberculosis, Jack's bodyguard and chief enforcer was Jerry Scacchio, a ruthless and violent Brooklyn goon who had been rising through the ranks of the Diamond Gang since they were robbing warehouses for furs and jewellery at the start of the decade. Thomas Fats Walsh, who was a participant in the failed robbery of Albert Levy, masterminded by Lucky Luciano a few years prior, was still ever loyal to Jack, as was Peter Felice, Salvatore Spitale, and Charles Intratta. All ruthless killers and enforcers with criminal records which, if read out in court, would double the trial time. The gang also implemented a few of their old security tactics from the Bronx Theatrical Club as well, installing a bulletproof front door behind an iron gate and a peephole just big enough for one of the many Thompson submachine guns Jack and his gang had on their person at all times. Having successfully Dutch Schultz proofed his barracks and equipped his army with the finest cars and firepower money could buy, Jack went about replicating his Manhattan operation in the greener and calmer atmosphere of upstate New York. Currently, the biggest bars and clubs in Cairo were all stocked by small-time bootleggers, usually making their own suds and spirits in their bathtubs. They had never encountered a bootlegger who was willing to use violence like Jack, or a bootlegging operation as organised and furnished as his before. Jack and the Diamond Gang quickly began throwing their weight around, and many of the independent, modest bootleggers were told to stay out or get rubbed out, to which all of them took the first option. Jack, seemingly almost overnight, became the sole supplier to the bars of Cairo before branching out across the Catskills and, most notably, replicating his terror tactics in the bigger city of Albany, just 30 miles north of Cairo. Here, Jack faced a little more resistance from the more organised gangs of bootleggers, but with his state-of-the-art Thompson submachine guns and reputation against the inferior pistols of the unknown bathtub brewers, after a few public shootouts, the like of which the streets of Albany had never seen before, they also followed suit and folded under the immense violent pressure that Jack was discharging upon them. Before long, Jack also took over the neighbouring cities of Troy, Hudson and Poughkeepsie, and quickly established himself as not the biggest bootlegger in New York City, but the biggest bootlegger in upstate New York. Although it might not have the population or demand of the Big Apple, the smaller, more rural towns that Jack was supplying in the mountains were an absolute goldmine, just as he had envisaged in the weeks before leaving Manhattan. With the help of an old pal and seasoned bootlegger, Vanny Higgins, who had absorbed the territory of Jack's old nemesis, Big Bill Dreyer, and now kept the whole of Brooklyn wet, Jack had a regular fleet of Higgins's trucks making the trip upstate each week and supplying Jack with enough beer, gin and whiskey to keep every bar in a 50-mile radius stocked. In just under 3 months, Jack had absolutely monopolised his new territory and was making more money than he ever did in Manhattan. And although Jack enjoyed playing the country squire, he missed the glitz and glamour of the Big Apple and struck up a peace deal in April 1929 with Dutch Schultz, agreeing to pay the Dutchman $100,000 in cash, around $1.5 million today, to let him resume his lifestyle and his business in New York, to which Dutch agreed. After delegating his upstate business to his goons, Jack resurfaced in Manhattan in May 1929, and with no threat from Schultz, he purchased the Midtown Manhattan Speakeasy and renamed it the Hotsy Totsy Club. It goes without saying that Dutch had inherited the Bronx Theatrical Club whilst Jack was in hiding and eventually moved upstate, and Legs Diamond, being the attention and fame-craving sociopath he was, needed a new swanky joint to make his headquarters. The Hotsy Totsy Club was located on the second floor of 1721 Broadway between 54th and 55th Street. Jack and his partner Charles Intrater owned 50% of the club each, and before long it was the place to be seen in New York. Like his old dwellings, the club was dressed in the finest furs, kitted out with the finest china and stocked with the finest booze, which he had to buy from Schultz, another condition of their peace treaty. It was another slice of luxury in the Depression-era streets of Manhattan, and was a place for Jack to show off to his pals, enemies, police, and long list of female associates, when his rabble-rousing wife Alice wasn't pouring whiskey down her throat and mouthing off at the bar. It was an exclusive club in which one had to be invited to gain entrance. As such, it was a watering hole for sports figures, newspaper reporters, celebrities, and of course other gangsters who didn't want to mix with the riffraff. To help keep the peace amongst the aforementioned gangsters who opted to pop in for a beverage or two after a long day of murder and intimidation, Jack implemented some house rules to help deter trouble. The girl you brought was the girl you left with. No talking to another guy's girl and no taking another guy's girl. It seemed that if you abided to these simple rules, you would have an enjoyable and memorable time at the Hotsy Totsy Club, all courtesy from Gentleman Jack, as the ever-growing crowd of newspaper reporters who had recently made Jack's acquaintance were now dubbing him in the press, which was a nickname Jack preferred to Legs Diamond. However, on July the 13th, 1929, Gentleman Jack would remind his patrons why he was, in fact, one of the most feared and dangerous men in the city. At around 2 a.m, around 50 revellers were drinking and dancing in the Hotsy Totsy Club. You wouldn't have even suspected that the United States was in the infancy of a Great Depression or Prohibition. In fact, the place was so jam-packed and bouncing that Jack even took a turn behind the bar serving up drinks. Stunts like that were no doubt good for business. If word spread that a trip to the Hotsy Totsy might result in the semi-famous Legs Diamond pouring and serving your beer, those legitimate people who like to rub elbows with gangsters would surely seek an invitation. Amongst those delivering the drinks Gentleman Jack was preparing for the patrons were Tony Marola, William Wolgast and Tommy Ribbler, 3 waiters who had been working at the club for the last 2 months since it opened its doors. Also on hand was the club's entertainment manager, Jaime Cohen, who was delivering many a whiskey to a young boxer called Ruby Goldstein, who had lost a fight earlier that evening and was drowning his sorrows with pals Nathaniel Jarvis and Jack's partner, Charles Intrata. It was just another fun, roaring 20s evening at the Hotsy Totsy Club until the Cassidy brothers showed up. Unfortunately, any images of William Red Cassidy and Pete Cassidy have been lost to time, but they were 2 low-level waterfront thugs from Manhattan's West Side who were quick to use their fists. The Hotsy Totsy wasn't their first stop of the evening. They'd been in at least 15 other speakeasies beforehand and arrived at the club at around 2:30 a.m. with about 4 of their associates, including Simon Walker, and they were sufficiently inebriated. After indulging in a few drinks of gin poured by the fair hands of Jack himself, they eventually ended up at the table of Ruby Goldstein and began discussing that night's boxing match with him, of which the Cassidy crew were in attendance. With the gin talking for them, the Cassidys began insulting Ruby, particularly having a go at his boxing skills and saying that he wasn't fit for the ring. Naturally, Ruby, recently defeated and full of whiskey, reacted violently and quickly a ruckus developed between the 2 factions. Jack, from behind the bar, noticed that his partner Charles Intrata was involved in the fight and decided to intervene. He gave his entertainment manager, Jaime Cohen, a look which Jaime had received before, in which he walked over to the band and informed them to play the current number much louder, to which they complied. Gentleman Jack then jumped across the small bar and produced a pistol, dropping Simon Walker with 2 bullets to the back of the head. He then emptied his clip into Red Cassidy's back before realising that he'd have to pistol whip Pete Cassidy as he was out of ammo, and proceeded to do just that whilst everyone else rushed for the exits. In a matter of minutes, police arrived on the scene and found Walker lying dead in front of the bar, one hand on a pistol he never managed to fully draw out of his pocket. Red Cassidy, also expired, lay at the bottom of the stairway leading to the front door after tumbling down the stairs after Jack had ended his life. They also found Red Cassidy's brother, Pete, lying next to him at the bottom of the stairway, unconscious and worse for wear, but by no means dead. When Pete came around, he stuck to the gangster code, as Jack did in the murder of little Augie, and refused to say anything, even though his brother had just been brutally murdered. Police didn't waste any time down the dead end of information that was Pete Cassidy, and a few days after the murders, they managed to round up a dozen of the patrons who were at the Hotsy Totsy at the time of the murders, and most of the staff who were working that night. Tony Marola was arrested and held as a material witness and pressured into giving any information that could incriminate Jack and Intrata, who, speaking of which, had left town, currently hiding out at the Diamond Barracks in Accra, but upon hearing that Marola had been arrested, the duo returned to Manhattan to tie up some loose ends, namely eliminating any of the Hotsy Totsy staff that could corroborate anything that Tony Marola might say that would put the pair in the electric chair. Although he was never mentioned in the press, The first one to go was waiter Tommy Ribbler, a 21-year-old who was working at the Hotsy Totsy for extra cash after his day job, which was sheet metal work. After finishing work on the afternoon of the 16th of July, 3 days after the murders, Tommy Ribbler was forced into a sedan and never seen again. The day after, 3 guys were walking to work on the Bordentown Turnpike near South Amboy in New Jersey when they came across a body on the side of the road. The corpse had been perforated with 9 bullet holes, leading authorities to think that he had been machine gunned, and fingerprints showed that it was William Wolgast, another waiter employed by Gentleman Jack, who was working the night of the bloodbath. The police were now down 2 witnesses, and it would eventually be 3 because the Hotsy Totsy Club's entertainment manager Jaime Cohen, like Tommy Ribbler, was never seen nor heard from again. After a week had passed without any arrests, the NYPD turned up the heat on the underworld in their relentless pursuit of Entrata and the now bad boy of Broadway, another for Jack to add to his ever-growing list of nicknames and another which he was fond of. Now all of the Hotsy Totsy staff who were working that night had been murdered, apart from Tony Marola, and the NYPD knew that the pair were no longer out of town. So on the 18th of July 1929, they raided a total of 33 speakeasies and gambling joints in the Midtown area, arresting 87 people in their hunt for information on Jack and Entrata. This disruption of business strained the already ridiculously fragile relationship between Dutch Schultz and his former boss Jack, as he now owned most of those speakeasies which were raided and had lost a considerable amount of money. Eventually, the police questioned Schultz on his enemy's location and, still pissed off from the money Diamond had caused him to lose that night, told them to check the Catskills. This information that Dutch fed the police was correct. Knowing that Dutch was pissed off with him, Jack had fled back upstate. The police were obviously aware that Jack had a monopoly upstate, but for whatever reason, they didn't think to check his Accra fortress. When they did finally make it through the numerous levels of security surrounding the property, they were met by Salvatore Spitali and Jerry Scacchio, who said they hadn't been there. Sniffing for information in Albany, a train station clerk told the police that she had seen Entrata, his face now on thousands of wanted posters around the area, and his wife Anna just a few hours prior, and they bought tickets to Chicago. The NYPD wired this information down to their Windy City counterparts, who picked Charlie up at the train station, and before the sun went down, he was in NYPD custody, claiming he wasn't even in the Hotsy Totsy on the night of the murders. The next day, he was charged with first-degree murder and whisked off to the Tombs to await his day in court. The good news for Charlie was that the prosecutor's main witness, Tony Marola, who had already spent more than a month in the Tombs, was beginning to go a little cuckoo. No doubt aware of what had happened to Wolgast, Cohen and Ribbler, he apparently began to suffer psychosis and was sent to Bellevue Hospital, deeming whatever he was going to say in court pointless. The prosecution could not use a witness's statement who wasn't all there upstairs. With their main witness lost and one of the killers in custody, the heat was on to find Jack. It's true he did originally go to Upstate, but he never kept one address and he frequently moved around the states, spending the next 6 months avoiding police detection and drinking his way through Chicago mainly with his wife Alice. Chicago was the most corrupt city at the time, and this is where Jack felt safest, with the recent arrest and preceding court case of Al Capone's taking up most of the Chicago police's time, and with a few rolls of green in the right hands, Jack was able to keep a low profile and remain on the lam. In Jack's absence, his brother Eddie had checked out of the sanatorium that he'd spent the previous year in and returned to New York City, helping to run things at his speakeasy. This was short term, however, as Eddie was in the final stages of consumption, and at around 10 PM on January the 14th, 1930, Eddie's tuberculosis got the better of him and he unfortunately passed away. The NYPD were hopeful that Eddie's recent demise would be their big break. Everybody in New York knew that the only person Jack really cared about was his brother, and that it would be hard for him to pass up a last chance to say goodbye. Likewise, Jack knew that the police would use Eddie's death to get to him. The NYPD stationed 2 officers in the morgue with Eddie's body in case Jack either decided to come back to say goodbye to his brother or came back to supply necessary personal information for the death certificate and made the arrangements for Eddie's funeral. Otherwise, Eddie would be given a pauper's funeral, and Jack would not want that written in the press. Jack arranged for his pal and main supplier of booze, Vannie Higgins, to deal with the admin of the birth certificate and gave him $5,000 to arrange Eddie's funeral. On the day of Eddie's funeral, a number of detectives were waiting at the Westside funeral parlour where they believed Eddie's body was being stored. In fact, Vannie and Legs had outwitted the police by switching funeral homes at the last moment to one on the east side, and by the time Eddie's coffin arrived at his 93rd Street apartment where the gangster was laid out prior to his funeral, Jack had already said his goodbyes to his brother. Still hoping that Jack would try to sneak in a final goodbye, 12 detectives followed the 28-car funeral cortege to Mount Olivet Cemetery. Thinking that Jack might show up dressed as a woman, a tactic a few previous mobsters had used to attend funerals of loved ones whilst on the run, the detectives went up to each lady wearing a mourning veil and peeked under it, each time apologising for their intrusion. If Jack did manage to show up to his brother's funeral, nobody was any the wiser. A week after Eddie's final hurrah, Charlie and Tratter's trial for the Hotsy Totsy murders started. The prosecution linked him with the murder in its opening statement, but failed to produce any witnesses who would say that they saw Tratter fire a gun. Every witness the prosecution summoned to the stand blamed the fracas on the dead guys. All witnesses agreed that Red and Peter Cassidy insulted the boxer Ruby Goldstein and that Simon Walker drew for a gun. After that, nobody saw anything. No one could explain how Red ended up with 3 fatal shots in the back, or how Simon Walker ended up with 2 bullets through his skull. Even Peter Cassidy, sticking to the gangster code, couldn't shed any light on his brother's murder or how he ended up at the bottom of the stairwell, unconscious. After 3 days, no witnesses could finger Tratter as the gunman, and he was acquitted, which was music to Jack's ears. With Charlie off the hook and any witnesses to the Hotsy Totsy killings dead or silenced, Jack deemed it safe to come out of hiding. On March the 10th, 1930, he donned a long black overcoat with a matching hat, collected his lawyers and handed himself into the West 47th Street police station and approached Detective James Donnelly. "Hello, Jim. I hear you want me. Well, I'm here to surrender." Jack was arrested and sent to police headquarters for questioning. During his interrogation, Jack remained tight-lipped, squirming and changing the subject whenever the Hotsy Totsy murders were mentioned, but quite conversationable for the coming baseball season and Babe Ruth's form of late. Getting nowhere, the police sent Jack to the Tombs to await a hearing, and after spending a week and a half in prison, he was discharged on all murder counts. That night, he retired to a speakeasy on West 41st Street where a celebration dinner was thrown in his honour. Amongst the guests was an assistant district attorney and 2 judges, each of whom made a congratulations speech for Jack. Dutch Schultz had eventually calmed down, Jack was back in New York and ready to resume his business as a free man. As the Hotsy Totsy troubles were dying down, Jack found himself involved in another affair of different sorts. A new musical comedy called Simple Simon had opened to strong reviews at the Ziegfeld Theatre. The star of the show was comedian Ed Wynn, and one of the supporting players was a showgirl friend of Jack's named Dory Leslie. Towards the end of March, the cast of Simple Simon decided to head over to the club Abbey, a Dutch Schultz owned upmarket speakeasy which was a place to be seen amongst the who's who of New York, and with their show doing so well, a place the cast felt they belonged. Dory Leslie introduced Jack to a colleague of hers who was also in the show called Marion Strasmick, however her stage name was Kiki Roberts. "How do you do, Mrs. Roberts? I'm glad to meet you," Jack charmingly said to Kiki, who was immediately smitten with him, and the pair sat chatting and drinking for hours. At one point, when the girls were alone, Dory asked Kiki, "Do you know who that is?" Marion answered, "That's Legs Diamond. I know exactly who he is." Kiki would explain in a later interview with the New York Journal that she knew he was a gangster and she had learned a lot about him, so of course she wanted to meet him. Towards the end of the night, a good time was had by all, and Jack and Kiki got into his chauffeured Lincoln and he dropped her off at a hotel. "I've had a very pleasant time with you and hope to see you every night from now on," he told her. There was, however, one obstacle. Kiki was engaged and to be married to a band leader called Eddie Elkins on June the 2nd. Kiki had made it clear to Jack that she'd chosen him over Elkins, so after a polite word with Elkins, Diamond made it clear for Eddie and his band to leave town, and if they returned, he would kill them. Eddie complied and took the band to California. With the fiancée out the way and Alice tending to the house in Accra, Jack and Kiki were a constant item. He skyrocketed her career along by having New York City's best choreographers give her private lessons each day whilst he attended to business, but other than that, the pair were inseparable and began to receive more and more newspaper coverage, further propelling Diamond's fame. Unfortunately, their honeymoon period would be slightly disturbed a few months into their blossoming romance, however, as Jack planned to return to Europe to set up his own drug operation, something he'd been wanting to do since his former boss Arnold Rothstein had been slain. Funded not only by his own Upstate monopoly, but also by his partner Salvatore Spitale and his associate Irving Bitts, who would later be a suspect in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Jack planned to spearhead the resumption of flooding the streets of New York in dope, which had quietened down a little bit since Rothstein's death. On August the 13th, 1930, Jack walked to the Red Star Line's office and booked passage on the SS Belgenland under the name John Nolan for his first trip to Europe since 1926. The Belgenland raised anchor at 11 AM and headed out into the New York harbour. As the city's landscape slowly disappeared from view, Jack must have sighed a breath of relief. With his ever-growing fame, the last thing he wanted was to bring attention to himself or this trip, which could potentially jeopardise his embryonic drug operation. He no doubt felt somewhat satisfied as the SS Belgenland sailed away from New York, knowing he had managed to slip out of the city without any detection from the press or the police. In his mind, he was going to be able to enjoy a rare week of leisure before simply landing in Europe to purchase hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of heroin. Little did he know that before the Belgenland was even halfway across the Atlantic, his name would be front page news in Europe and the US, and his fellow passengers who were now passing him on the decks without giving him a second glance would soon be asking for his autograph. Back in upstate New York, detectives who were assigned to dismantle Jack's bootlegging enterprise coincidentally swooped on his Accra fortress 3 days after he set sail, not knowing he was out of the country. Having rounded up and arrested his gang and wife Alice, they conducted a search of the house and were getting ready to leave when one of the detectives spotted 3 large suitcases under the bed. Intrigued, the detectives expected to find cash and maybe a pistol or two. Instead, they found this incredible arsenal, which was the firepower Jack and his gang had used to intimidate the smaller bootleggers of upstate New York before his takeover, when really he could have taken on a small army with what he had at his disposal. The haul included 2 black powder bombs, 3 pipe bombs, 3 tear gas bombs, 18 hand grenades, 6 Doug grenades, 5 steel vests, 3 waist protectors, 3 signal guns with 13 rounds, 4 rifles with silencers, 6 Thompson submachine guns, 2 submachine gun stocks, 16 25 round machine gun clips, 22 fountain pen pistols, 29 boxes of ammo ranging in caliber from 22 to 45, 150 loose bullets of different sizes, a gallon of tear gas and a manual for using a Thompson submachine gun. Like I said, enough to go to battle with a small army. This picture made front page news and astonished the public, most having never seen so much firepower in one place. Needless to say, knowing Jack was at the helm of the gang, they were very interested in the gang members they had now taken back to the station. Thomas Fats Walsh, Jerry Scaccio, Peter Felice and Salvatore Spitale all kept the same story when interrogated, explaining to the police that the gang had agreed to look after the arsenal for a sailor for $10 a month. However, all 4 of them couldn't give a description of this sailor or knew where he was now. Alice also kept tight-lipped, and it wasn't until August the 30th that detectives discovered that Jack was sailing on the Belgenland. The ship's first stop was Plymouth, England. Word of Jack's impending arrival was sent to Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the British police. Though there was no arrest warrant for Jack in New York, Scotland Yard labelled him as an undesirable alien. and would refuse him permission to land once the boat docked at the port in Plymouth. Once the English papers caught wind that there was a bona fide American gangster on the way over, they captured the public's imagination and had a field day, printing stories about Jack. Jack, none the wiser, spent most of the time on board the Belgenland smoking, drinking and playing poker. By the time the Belgenland arrived in England, Jack was famous. On the morning the ship landed, Jack was first approached by members of Scotland Yard who told him he wouldn't be allowed off the boat, which didn't bother him anyway because his destination was the ship's second stop, Antwerp. Then he was approached by reporters from the English newspapers, a couple hundred of them if truth be told, and the narcissistic Jack basked in his transatlantic fame. Speaking to the press, Jack tried to excuse his trip to Europe for medical reasons. "They haven't got a thing on me. I don't mind about not landing in England, but I hope I'm not going to be stopped from landing anywhere on the continent. I don't want to be sent back to New York. I intend to go to Vichy to get the cure. I have stomach and liver trouble and I've been told to come and take the waters." When he was asked about the recently discovered arsenal which was surfacing on the front pages of the US and UK papers, Jack laughed it off. "I ain't got no house in the Catskills. I live in Manhattan. I don't know nothing about an arsenal." Once the reporters had been ushered off the deck, the ship set sail to Antwerp. On the relatively short journey, Jack was approached constantly by women asking him to autograph their menus and passenger booklets, which Jack obliged, obviously. The next morning, the Belgenland docked in Antwerp and Jack headed down the gangplank, immediately swamped by Belgian journalists. Before Jack could answer a question, he was approached by detectives and taken to Antwerp City Hall. There, he was told he was also an undesirable and that he had to leave at once. He was told to pick any of the countries on the Belgian border as a destination, and he picked Germany and was boarded onto a train with a Belgian escort to Hamburg at request from the Berlin police. When the US diplomat's office found out that Jack was headed for Germany, the American embassy in Berlin were notified and asked the Belgian police to put him on a train headed for Hamburg specifically, as there they had a ship ready to take him straight back to the States before his feet had time to sample German soil. As he disembarked the train at Hamburg station, the freighter Hanover was waiting for him with around 10 German detectives to usher him on. Also on hand were over 200 people hoping to catch a glimpse of the American gangster. As he walked to the ship, one of the onlookers asked him how he was, to which Jack replied, "Swell, but I really don't like Germany." On September the 22nd, after 16 days at sea, the Hanover pulled into Philadelphia, where even more people than in Hamburg were waiting to catch a glimpse of their now infamous native son. Jack was escorted down the gangplank to a sedan through the crowd by police, and as the reporters hounded him, he made it clear on his stance with their kind. "The next newspaper man that asks me a question, I'll punch in the nose," Jack said. "They got me into all this trouble, although I ain't done nothing. You hear me? I'll punch the first one in the nose." Needless to say, as Jack was helped into the sedan by both NYPD and Philadelphia detectives, the reporters kept quiet. His reputation now feared not just in New York, but across the whole of the United States. Diamond was taken to the local precinct and posed for this mugshot, where you can tell he looks happy to be there. "You have no right to arrest me," he yelled in the station. "I was born and raised here in Philadelphia. I have lots of friends here and I don't care for this publicity." His complaints fell on deaf ears as Jack spent the night in a cell before his hearing the next day at the City Hall. Jack agreed to leave Philadelphia immediately if the judge discharged him, and an agreement was met. The hearing started at 10 a.m. and by 10:45 a.m. Jack's lawyer, Murray Rosenthal, was whisking his client back to the Accra fortress, which no doubt had its arsenal resupplied since the raid the previous month. There was far too much money involved in the European drug deal for Jack to sever his ties with it, so his first order of business back in New York was to figure a way of getting into Germany undetected. Those who invested in the trip, namely Salvatore Spitali and Irving Bitts, wanted their money back pronto, but Jack declined. He told them that he'd return to Europe and make the deals. End of story. However, the bootlegging pair felt that Jack was too hot and attracted too much limelight, and he'd never make it to Europe without being followed by a herd of reporters and wanted their investment refunded. On October the 9th, Jack left his Accra barracks and returned to Manhattan, setting himself up at the Hotel Monticello, located at 35 West 64th Street. Jack settled in room 829, and leaving Alice in Accra, he set Kiki Roberts, his true love, up across the way in room 831. In room 833 was the ever-present Jerry Scacchio and Peter Felice. That night, Jack stayed up drinking and smoking with business associates until around 2 a.m. before hitting the sack in Kiki's room. At 10 a.m, Ernie Muller, who lived next door to the Hotel Monticello, was out front fixing his car when he noticed a brand new Chrysler pull up across the street. He saw 3 men get out and thought it was quite odd that they left their engine running and one of the doors open. A few moments after, Kiki received a call from the hotel operator, explaining that there was a call for Jack, so she woke him up. After a brief exchange, Jack explained there was a couple of guys coming up and told Kiki to take a bath. Jack opened the door to Salvatore Spitale, Irving Bitts, and Dutch Schultz main henchman, Bo Weinberg, who Jack must have been on good terms with, to not immediately draw for his gun when he saw him. It seems that although Jack and Dutch still had a peace treaty, Dutch was approached by Jack's ex-pals Spitale and Bitts and took up the opportunity to get revenge on his former boss for setting up the murder of his partner, Joey Noy. Kiki heard Jack say, "Let's go to my room and talk about it, gentlemen." A few minutes later, gunshots echoed through the 8th floor of the Hotel Monticello, and back outside, Ernie Muller saw the 3 men run from the hotel and jump back into the Chrysler and speed off. The whole affair took less than 4 minutes. Jack staggered out of room 829 with blood pouring out of bullet wounds in his right shoulder, left armpit and the centre of his chest. He was also leaking blood from his face, the result of a bullet fired into his forehead. Luckily for Jack, he was falling backwards when that slug struck him. Although it lodged in his scalp, it didn't pierce his skull. Jack made his way to Marion's room, collapsed on the bed and demanded that she order him an ambulance straight away. She phoned the hotel manager, Jacob Ginsberg, and the call was made to McDougall's ambulance service. Whilst waiting for the ambulance, a distraught Kiki asked if she could get Jack anything, in between holding towels to his leaking wounds, to which he replied, "Yes, get me a big drink of whiskey." As Jack was guzzling to ease his pain, Scacchio ran in and asked who shot him. Dismissing the question, Jack told him in front of Kiki, "Jerry, I want you to take care of my wife Alice and see that nobody gives her the worst of it in Accra. Tell her to have Judge Pryor in Albany take care of all her business up there. It looks like I am going. I've 8 shots in me, 4 around my heart and 1 in my head." Jack was rushed to the Polyclinic Hospital and police placed armed guards on Jack's floor with no hospital personnel allowed entry. Guards were also stationed outside the hospital as well, and for good measure. Once word got out Jack wasn't dead, the hospital's switchboard received over 2,000 calls inquiring about Jack, with some of those definitely coming from his underworld enemies. When news of the shooting reached Accra, Alice chartered a plane to the city and comforted him at his bedside, whilst Jerry Scacchio was sorting a priest for the couple, with it not looking likely that Jack would pull through. Police were still relentlessly questioning Jack on his deathbed, but he refused to answer any questions and told them to get lost. After 20 minutes of questioning, police took Alice to the station for further interrogation, where she, for the first time, after seeing her picture printed hundreds of times in the newspapers with Jack, met Kiki Roberts in person. The New York Evening Journal reported that the 2 women exchanged nasty looks with each other, but no words were ever passed, hitting dead ends with both Kiki and Alice, who were well drilled by Jack to keep tight-lipped. The police began pulling in suspects. Whilst Jack lingered somewhere between life and death, his enemy Dutch Schultz rival bootlegger Waxy Gordon, and his pal Charlie Luciano were brought into questioning, but all had alibis that checked out. As the days passed, Jack began to pull through and bounce back. When news first spread of the shooting, the papers and the bookies were giving odds of 100 to 1 that he would live. By day 4, the odds had been slashed to 50-50, which gobsmacked the whole city, not to mention infuriated his once pals turned enemies Salvatore Spitale and Irving Bitts, who thought that they'd gotten revenge on Jack for their European investments going to squat. Upon hearing that Jack was going to survive, Dutch Schultz remarked to his gang, "Geez, ain't there nobody that can shoot this guy so that he doesn't bounce back?" A week after the shooting, on Friday the 17th of October, the superintendent of the Polyclinic Hospital received a call from a man who didn't identify himself. "You better get protection for all your hospital patients," the man warned, "because they're going to blow up the hospital to get legs diamond good tonight." Knowing the kind of enemies that Jack had and what they were capable of, the NYPD took no chances, and within the hour, Jack was on his way back to where he spent the most unhappy year of his life, Blackwell's Island. This time though, he wasn't going to be violently abused in prison by the staff, but he was going to the Metropolitan Hospital. With over 500 people gathered outside the hospital to catch a glimpse of the gangster, he was escorted through New York by 5 cars of armed guards and a group of motorcycle cops to clear traffic. The NYPD taking such measures to move Jack onto his own island for his own safety really shows the level of infamy and enemies he had at the time. The Hotel Monticello shooting, the bomb threat at the hospital, and the transferring between hospitals again made front page news, and Jack was without a doubt the most famous gangster in New York at the time, and probably second behind Al Capone in the United States. After a number of weeks, the doctors removed all but 2 of the bullets lodged in Jack's body, deeming it too risky to remove the ones in and around his heart. They were still astounded, like the rest of New York City, that Jack was still breathing, carrying around 2 bullets in his body which were a constant reminder of Salvatore Spitale, once a friend who had now betrayed him and tried to end his life over not receiving a refund for his European investment. Jack spent the next 2.5 months in hospital before being released on New Year's Eve 1930. Knowing that his release would be a media event, Jack dressed in snappy attire. Although he looked gaunt, he sported the finest clothes in the way of a grey overcoat, a new checkered cap and a blue pinstripe suit. This is the footage which the New York Evening Journal took, no doubt making its way to television screens that night, which would have pleased Jack. Before boarding a train back to Accra, Jack spoke to the press for a couple of minutes. "I don't know who shot me. I've only been in New York for 30 days in the past 2 years, as the police know. I'd be lying if I said I knew who shot me," Jack told the reporters. He went on to say that he was looking forward to getting back to Accra. "You know, we're 6 miles from Electric Light there, and it's a good place to rest." One of the more quick-witted reporters amongst them quipped, "Better than the Monticello anyways," to which Jack responded with a smile before boarding the train with Alice and a party of 5 plainclothes cops. After a relatively quiet first 4 months of 1931, by April, Jack resurfaced back in the Catskills. He had come to the realisation that he couldn't keep Kiki in Manhattan with the heat, and therefore Alice left him and he moved Kiki into his Accra fortress. He had also come to the realisation that he was done in New York City. All the press he received from his ill-fated trip to Europe and the subsequent shooting at the Monticello, not to mention the numerous mobsters that wanted him dead, made sure of that. His infamy also meant no more trips to Europe to set up drug deals, but he did still have his liquor business in upstate New York. That is, until a chance encounter on a dark road with a small-time booze hauler brought it all crashing down. On the evening of the 15th of April 1931, Jack, Kiki, Jerry Scaccio and new recruit to the gang, James Dalton, were touring some local speakeasies in and around Albany for pleasure, drinking and conversing the night away. On their way back home down Route 23, they spotted a truck which they suspected was full of booze, as during Jack's hospital visit, a few bars and clubs in Cairo had begun using a different supplier. Since Jack's ordeal in Europe and the Monticello shooting, Scaccio had been heading up the Upstate operation nearly alone, as the Diamond crew had been sufficiently depleted. Peter Felice had been shot and killed in Manhattan by a police officer during a car chase, whilst Tommy Fats Walsh was killed in Miami over a gambling dispute. Charlie and Tratter had distanced himself from the gang after the Hotsy Totsy murders in what was a close shave with the electric chair and had moved to Chicago. Salvatore Spitale had gone against Jack after the failed drug deal in Europe, and Eddie Diamond was dead, so it was safe to say the Diamond crew was heavily depleted. With the mobster population a lot less in upstate New York than in Manhattan, and with very few aspiring mobsters wanting to work for someone with the heat that Jack had on him, the crew was depleted down to just a handful, with James Dalton being the newest recruit. Jack ordered Dalton, who was driving the Ford sedan, to speed alongside the truck, which was being driven by Grover Parks, a small-time booze hauler from Albany. Looking into his rearview mirror, Parks noticed the car speeding towards them with its headlights off. The sedan, as Jack instructed, pulled up alongside the truck, with Jerry and Jack each pointing a pistol at Grover Parks. Jack yelled at him to pull over and get out of the truck. Both vehicles came to a stop and Parks climbed out. He was approached by Jack, who told him to throw up his hands. When Parks didn't immediately comply, Gentleman Jack punched him in the face. Inspecting the haul and realising it was booze, Jack again punched Parks before pulling his cap over his eyes and throwing him into the back of the sedan. Grover Parks had an underling called James Duncan also riding with him, who was kidnapped and taken into Albany and dropped into a street, as Jack knew that Parks was the main man with the information. Kiki and Jack drove Parks' truck back to the fortress in Accra, and Dalton followed them. Jack sent Kiki into the house while Scaccio and Dalton sat Parks on the floor in the garage. Jack began to interrogate Parks, demanding to know what they were hauling and where they were taking it. Parks, however, was not in a talking mood and remained tight-lipped during Jack's questioning, so Gentleman Jack decided to use other tactics to make the truck driver talk. He held matches to his bare feet and tied a noose around Parks' neck, hoisting him off the ground using a tree in the garden. When Parks fell unconscious, Jack threw a bucket of water over him. When Parks had his senses back, he had a gun to his ear. Jack fired 5 shots near his feet, narrowly missing Parks to prove that he was serious, and told Parks that he had one more chance to talk, but Parks still refused to answer. Frustrated, but not in a killing mood, Jack let Parks go. Perhaps it was the whiskey that was coursing through Jack's veins that was responsible for this violent episode, or perhaps he was just in a bad mood. Whatever the reason, his poor decision making during this run-in would prove to be his downfall. The following day, Parks went to the Greene County Sheriff Department and told his story. Warrants were issued for Scaccio, Dalton and Jack, and all 3 were arrested on the morning of April the 17th. Jack faced a judge a week later and pleaded not guilty and paid a $25,000 bail. Upon arriving home, Jack had found that Kiki had set up a welcome home party and drank until the early hours, celebrating his release. Whilst Jack and his friends were indulging in whiskey, the other residents of the Catskills were congregating on Jack's behalf, but for a very different reason. Local businesses and speakeasy owners in the area could easily see themselves being the next hanging from a tree or having their feet scorched, and they began talking to the Catskill District Attorney to help the future case of torture that Jack was going to be facing. They didn't appreciate their neighbours being tortured, and most agreed the Catskills would be a better place if Jack wasn't part of it. There were also many others, mainly Dutch Schultz, who were also wanting to put an end to Jack, but he wasn't taking his frustrations to the authorities or making statements to the press. He was organising for the best hitmen in his ranks to pay Gentleman Jack a little visit. On the evening of April the 26th, 2 days after being released on bail, Jack and Jerry Scacchio went to the Saratoga Inn, Jack's favourite hangout in upstate New York. This wasn't a usual drinking mission, however, as Jack was expecting an important phone call. An undisclosed underworld associate was going to call Jack, possibly his old pal Oni Madden, to discuss expanding his upstate monopoly with Oni's funding, and Jack didn't want to take the call at home in case his phone was being tapped. Scacchio and Jack had a few drinks, and after about 4 hours and several trips to the phone room, Jack told the Saratoga Inn's owner, James Wynn, "If he calls, tell him I waited until 12:30 AM, will you?" With that, Jack put on his hat and coat and headed for the exit. Scacchio was still inside the bar when everyone heard the first blast from a 12-gauge automatic shotgun. The glass from the front windows of the Saratoga Inn shattered as shots peppered the wall, and one of the pellets blew the cap from Jack's head. Jack turned his body just as the gunman pulled the trigger for the second time. Though most of the shot missed, 4 pellets slammed into his body and he dropped to the floor. For the second time in 6 months, and the 4th time since 1925, Jack felt the pain of hot, burning lead inside his body. As the front of the Saratoga was being sprayed with bullets, the innkeeper, James Wynn, doused the lights and everybody hit the deck. Scacchio crawled to his fallen boss and dragged him back into the barroom. As the assailants sped off, remarkably, Jack rose to his feet and shouted at them, "Bum shooting, better luck next time," leaving the petrified bar full of patrons gobsmacked, not for the first time in his life. Jack collapsed onto a bar stool and was in a severely bad way. Scacchio and James Wynn lifted Jack into the backseat of his sedan. Jack told him to head to Albany Hospital, and Scacchio made the 50-plus mile trip as Gentleman Jack's blood soaked into the rear cushions. At about 1:30 AM, Scacchio and Wynn lifted Jack out of the car and set him down in front of a shocked nurse. "Here's $100, Scacchio said as he greased the nurse's palms. "Take care of this man." News of the shooting filtered down to New York City just before dawn, and Alice, who had returned to the Big Apple after leaving Jack, raced down to Albany Hospital. Speaking to a reporter at Jack's bedside whilst they took this photo, she said of Kiki Roberts, "I belong with him, not her. At times like this, her kind don't count." Just as it was after the Hotel Monticello shooting, the news from Jack's doctors was grim. "He is very, very bad. I doubt he can make it," the doctor told the press. 1 pellet had fractured his left arm. He had 1 pellet in each of his right lung and liver, as well as 1 in his back. The doctor's prognosis wasn't the only bad news for Jack. Less than 48 hours after the shooting, New York City Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt had been receiving complaints about Jack and his gang from the Catskill District Attorney amidst the torture trial, and had ordered the New York State Attorney General, John Bennett, to eliminate the Diamond Gang from the Catskills. What had originally been a local problem and definitely fixable with bribery or knocking off the witnesses, as he had done with the Hotsy Totsy murders, was now national news. A local judge could be had. The governor of New York was another story. John Bennett jumped into action by sending 30 state troopers to the Catskills to protect Grover Parks and other witnesses from speakeasies present the night Jack carried out his torture, to prevent any of them going missing or turning up machine-gunned on the side of the road. Meanwhile, Jack's condition in the hospital was deteriorating. On May the 1st, the doctor in charge of Jack, Dr. Holmes, told the press that 1/3 of his right lung had collapsed and there is danger of pus entering the cavity made by the slug. This slug is about the size of a marble in the right lung. Diamond has a severe case of pleurisy but remains conscious at all times, though he talks very, very little. With Jack out of action in hospital and the rest of his gang fleeing upstate New York since John Bennett and his state troopers had entered the area, the government agents began helping to build a case for Jack if he was to live. With the public's help, who had now all turned against Diamond and his gang, They found numerous stashes and hold-ups of Jack's in and around the Catskills, including $5,000 worth of whiskey and champagne hidden just behind the Saratoga Inn. They also found the locations of all the Diamond Gang's breweries and stills and shut them down. His Accra fortress, now desolate with Kiki also flying back to New York, was raided by detectives who found a smaller arsenal of weapons and ammo, plus papers which showed customers and clients of Jack's. His safety deposit boxes were raided from the First National Bank in Cairo, which also had a list of names of truckmen, beer runners and speakeasy owners that Jack had intimidated in the area while setting up his upstate monopoly. Along with Grover Parks, the other intimidated bootleggers were rounded up and agreed to be witnesses in the torture case, which was rapidly expanding. In total, when the police were quite finished, Jack had 8 indictments against him and his gang. They were looking at violation of the Sullivan Law, in which citizens had to gain a permit to carry a concealable weapon. He was also looking at coercion, extortion, second-degree assault against Grover Parks, unlawful entry, possession and control of a still, and last but not least, conspiracy to violate the Prohibition Law, which carried a hefty fine and sentence of its own. Scacchio, Dalton and Kiki went on the lam, whilst Jack was again starting another miraculous recovery. The doctors didn't think it was a good idea to go probing for the shotgun pellets in his lungs or liver, so he would end up carrying them around as souvenirs, along with the earlier slugs of spitales from the Monticello shooting, but he did have the other pellets removed. His infections were clearing up, and within 2 weeks he was able to walk around the hospital. Again, the underworld was scratching their heads, thinking what was it they had to do to put an end to Diamond, and Jack must have felt invincible. 1 month to the day after he was shot, Jack was examined by a doctor who determined that he was healthy enough to be transferred to the Catskill County Jail. On the morning of May the 30th, Jack was escorted out of Albany Hospital by 4 state troopers and ushered into a sedan which was sandwiched between 2 more sedans packed with even more armed state troopers. Knowing that his underworld rivals would have been fizzing about his unbelievable survival, they were taking no chances. A few days later, on June the 1st, Jack pleaded not guilty and his trial date was set for July the 13th and to take place in the city of Troy, a few miles from Albany. By this time, Scacchio, Dalton and Kiki had all been rounded up and were awaiting their separate trials as well. As the trial began, security in and around the courthouse in Troy during Jack's trial for the Grover Parks torture case was tight. A squad of Brooklyn and Manhattan cops were patrolling the courtroom looking for known gangsters from New York, whilst the ever-present state troopers in plain clothes were seated and heavily armed throughout the room in the event of trouble. 7 county deputies were on hand at the court's entrance, accompanied by around 15 state troopers to escort witnesses to and from the courtroom. A crowd of over 200 people gathered around the courthouse waiting to get a glimpse of Jack, and at around 10 AM, Jack hopped out of a taxi and proceeded to enter the court. A few minutes later, the trial began, and the first in the long list of affairs to address was that Jack's bail was to be revoked throughout the duration of the trial, so any time outside of the courthouse was to be spent in jail. The prosecution case took a few days and they used minimal evidence, mainly Parks' recount of the night to convince the jury that Jack was guilty. Parks' underling, James Duncan, wasn't too much help on the stand, and it's thought that Jack and his goons had put the fear of God into the young booze runner, who didn't want to be too helpful a week after having a Thompson submachine gun stuck down his throat by the Diamond Gang. Shortly after, it was time for Jack's defence to earn the thousands of dollars that he had paid for them. They brought in a number of witnesses who were all paid off that could place Jack in a Greene County speakeasy at the time of the attack, miles away from Albany. First of all, it was 3 musicians from a speakeasy called the Owl's Head in Jefferson Heights. They explained that Jack arrived with Kiki around 7 PM and left at around 4 AM, meaning that during the Grover Parks torture, Jack was not in Albany. A former Greene County sheriff, also with greased palms, backed this up by saying that he was in the speakeasy and spent a few hours with Jack at the alleged time. Next, and the card the defence played that really swerved the jury's thinking, was Dr. Ripin, a local Catskills doctor who also accepted a few bulging brown envelopes from the Diamond Gang, explained that Jack had come to him during the early hours of the morning for toothache, and Dr. Ripin prescribed him cocaine drops to numb the pain. Producing the scripts for the medicine, Jack grinned. The jury retired to consider its verdict, and after 2 hours, they came back with a not guilty verdict in the Grover Parks torture case. The courtroom erupted and Alice ran to congratulate her husband. Jack hugged his defence attorneys and avoided the press outside before returning to his Accra fortress. Around a month later, Jack spoke to the New York Daily News, and when asked about his future plans, he explained, "I'm going away to get some rest. You know, I had a bad struggle in the hospital. Then before I had a chance to get back any strength, they put me in jail. Then I've spent the last month busy with the trial and I'm not in good shape." Jack was right. He wasn't in good shape. It was only 3 months after the Saratoga Inn shooting and he still hadn't fully recovered. His health wasn't great, and suspecting that it was Dutch Schultz who sent the assassins to the Saratoga, his paranoia wasn't too good either. He opted to stay in Albany after his trial, deeming that he felt safer in a bigger city where he could melt into the crowds. Albany authorities knew that he was staying in their town, and a detachment of detectives followed him around to ensure he wasn't bumped off. This was partly because they didn't want the most famous gangster not behind bars in the United States murdered in their city, but they also didn't want him getting off the next inevitable trial scot-free. Yes, Jack had been acquitted in the kidnapping case, but he still had plenty more indictments to face. Either way, these 3 bodyguards were a plus for Jack. To his delight, Jack wouldn't need the bodyguards for at least a few months. Back in New York, Jack's enemy, Dutch Schultz, was in the middle of the bloodiest gang war the city had ever seen. Manhattan and the Bronx had been turned into a shooting gallery by Dutch's old main hitman, Vincent Coll, who had rebelled against Dutch and started a gang war with his old boss for territory. The war took around 40 lives on both sides, and blood flowed through New York streets like it had never done before. Vincent Coll had actually scared Dutch Schultz into reclusiveness, and Jack was the least of his worries for now. As winter approached, Jack was recovering to full health and preparing for his second trial of the year. Although the Parks case had been dismissed, the state was going to try and get him for kidnapping Parks' young sidekick, James Duncan. Held in the same courtroom in Troy, the trial started on December the 8th. Jack's defence moved for a dismissal, arguing double jeopardy, as Jack had already been acquitted for the same charges during the Parks trial. In all honesty, the state was clutching at straws with this trial, as Jack had already been acquitted and was likely to be again. After 3 days of the trial and just 25 minutes of deliberation, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict. They said that they felt Grover Parks and James Duncan were bootleggers just as Diamond was. They're all racketeers and the statements couldn't be trusted. Once again, Jack smiled, a little less ecstatically this time, as he felt the whole week had been a complete waste of time. Vincent Coll was now dubbed by the press as Mad Dog Coll, and his gang were currently in jail for a failed hit on a Dutch Schultz henchman where they had shot and killed a 5-year-old boy, hence Coll's new nickname. Upon hearing that Dutch was no longer occupied with the Mad Dog, Jack moved from his Accra fortress to Albany for safety. He moved into a rooming house at 67 Dove Street where he set up base. With more trials set at the courthouse in Troy, and even though it was guarded by over 30 state troopers, Jack knew that Dutch's guys could tail him to and from the trial and thought it'd be easier and safer to melt into the city to avoid detection by Dutch Schultz and his gang. On December the 18th, Jack, his goons and Alice were at an Albany speakeasy drinking, still celebrating the acquittal of the most recent trial. They were discussing future plans to to which Jack was suggesting the gang move south, away from Manhattan, away from the legal troubles of upstate New York, and away from Dutch Schultz's assassins. The day before Mad Dog Col and his gang were arrested, Col had reached out to Diamond and suggested that the two factions combine and set up a bootlegging operation in the Carolinas. They both had Dutch Schultz as an enemy in common, and Col had had most of his crew, including his brother Peter, murdered by the Schultz entourage. Col, more than likely, had been given a contract at some point to murder Diamond by Schultz, but with the two mobsters now having him as an enemy, Diamond was seriously considering Mad Dog's offer. After Mad Dog was arrested, Jack still wanted to get away from the heat of New York and set up shop somewhere far, far away. Conversation surely turned slurred after a few hours of indulging themselves in Jack's whiskey. At around 1 AM, Jack decided he wanted to leave his wife Alice for the night and return to his real love, Kiki Roberts, who was still awaiting trial from being part of the Diamond entourage on the night of the kidnapping. Jack rang Kiki from the phone room and told Alice that he'd be back in an hour and he had to go see a business associate, which I'm sure she believed. Jerry Scaccio drove Jack to Kiki's place, another rooming house in Albany that Alice didn't know about. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, Jerry went to Kiki's apartment and woke Jack up, who had fallen asleep. "Jack, come on, get out of here before Alice starts looking for you," Jerry told him. Jack, who had drunk a lot and was now 3 sheets to the wind, as the sailors say, wobbled out of Kiki's room with a little help from Jerry and down to the sedan. Jack didn't want to go back to the house that Alice was staying at, presumably because he was to receive earache from her about where he'd been, so he ordered Jerry to take him back to 67 Dove Street, where they pulled up shortly after. Jack got out of the car and stumbled to the front door. He took out his key but was too plastered to open the door. Jerry, on hand to rescue his boss again, opened the door and put him to bed. When Jack was safe and sound asleep, Jerry locked the front door and drove off. 20 minutes or so later, two figures, probably Bo Weinberg and another Schultz loyalist, exited a maroon sedan that had been parked there all night, waiting for Jack to return. They approached the front door and picked the lock before quietly making their way up the stairs and approaching Jack's room. Letting themselves in, they crept over the bed and stood over the man who had, up until this point, seemed unkillable. Just inches from the face that graced thousands of newspapers, both in the States and abroad, Bo Weinberg placed his pistol to Jack's ear. He pulled the trigger 3 consecutive times and then twice more before they dashed from the room. The rooming house landlady, Mrs. Woods, awoke with the shots and heard the killers run into the hall. One of the men questioned whether they had fired enough bullets into Jack, to which the other one replied, "Oh hell, that's enough for him," and they raced out the front door and sped off in their sedan. Mrs. Woods slowly made her way up the stairs. The smell of gunpowder was still thick in the air as she peeked into Jack's room. There, Jack lay on the bed, his arms at his sides and his head tilted to the right. Not needing to see anything else, she ran to the phone and called Jerry and Alice. "I think there's been a shooting upstairs," she told the pair. Alice was hysterical from the get-go. "Oh my Jack, what have they done to you? They've shot Jack. Help me somebody." With the cries on repeat, she was screaming, whilst Jerry Scaccio held back tears at the sight of his former boss on the bed. Jerry called an underworld doctor and asked him to come round at once, which he did, and verified what everybody already knew. The clay pigeon of the underworld had finally had its wings clipped. The man who had danced with the devil and cheated death many, many times, Jack Legs Diamond, was now dead, aged just 34. Not until 7 AM did anybody call the police, to which they responded in around half an hour. The first thing they saw was Alice crying at the top of the stairs, screaming, "They have killed my Jack." They took her to the 4th Precinct police station to calm her down and question, along with everybody else present at the time. Whilst the rest of the gang were being questioned, Kiki Roberts was waking up to the sound of newsboys outside her window, yelling, "Extra, extra, Jack Diamond slain." Her head still foggy from sleep and booze, she fainted at the news that the man she had shared a bed with just 4 hours prior was now room temperature in an Albany morgue. The killer, who was worried about whether they had pumped enough bullets into Jack and if he would survive, needed not to fret. In fact, during his autopsy, it was revealed that the first shot was enough to end the life of Jack. The second and third were simply assurances for Bo Weinberg. Each bullet perforated the left side of Jack's head, and one of them entered under his ear, passed through his neck and exited the right side at the base of his skull. Another entered in front of the ear and passed through his brain. The third entered at the top of the ear and passed through the length of his skull, coming out just above his right ear. After the autopsy, Jack's body was removed to an Albany funeral parlour where Alice sorted out the funeral. On December the 22nd, 4 days after his murder, heavy rain fell as Jack's coffin was carried out to the hearse that would transport him to Mount Olivet Cemetery. A couple hundred attended Jack's burial, which was mostly silent, and Alice shouted the words "Goodbye, boy," as Jack was lowered into his final resting spot. An unmarked grave to deter interested parties who had read so much about Legs Diamond in the press. To this day, Mount Olivet Cemetery will not disclose Jack's resting place. On January the 2nd, 1932, 2 weeks after Diamond's assassination, but still the biggest subject in the New York papers, Kiki Roberts took full advantage. She sold her story to the New York Journal and even sat down with the paper to record this interview with them, accompanied by her mother. Surprisingly, she was quite jovial considering she had just lost the man she claimed to love a few days prior.
Tell me, did you really love Jack Diamond?
Yes, I loved him dearly and interrupted my stage career because of my love for him.
How did this famous gangster treat you?
He treated me wonderful, kind and lovable. I wouldn't know a gunman if I saw one.
Aren't you sorry you didn't take your mother's advice and keep away from Diamond?
Yes, but all young girls think they know it all.
Well, when did you see Diamond alive for the last time, Miss Roberts?
About 11 p.m. on the day of his acquittal in Albany.
How did you learn that he had been murdered?
When I awakened by newsboys' cries, "Jack Diamond slain."
Well, what happened then?
I fainted, and I nearly fell out of the bedroom window.
Miss Roberts, what advice have you for other girls who are tempted?
I'd advise them to live good, clean lives and obey their parents' wishes.
What are your plans for the future, Miss Roberts?
To resume my stage career where it was broken and give Mother no more heartaches.
Well, Mother, what have you got to say?
Oh, I'm the happiest woman in the world today that I have Marion back with me. I prayed night and day to have her with me for Christmas, and God has answered my prayer.
In the story of Kiki Roberts, she tried to use her love affair with Jack to propel her dancing career, which failed. It proved the money Jack spent on choreographers was pointless, as she had no natural talent, and she returned to her native Boston in 1935, leaving Manhattan when she became irrelevant. By the 1940s, she had disappeared from the limelight, and nothing is known of her life after this. Attempts at finding her whereabouts and her death date have been unsuccessful. Unfortunately, Jack's other romantic interest, Alice, also didn't have a happy ending. After she was questioned by police and they were happy she didn't have any information to give about Jack's death, she returned to Manhattan, inheriting the little money that Diamond had left. Struggling for cash, she made a few appearances as a sideshow on Coney Island for extra income as Mrs. Jack Legs Diamond, and carried on her hell-raising appearances at New York speakeasies, blabbering her mouth about her husband after several whiskies. In fact, it was this aforementioned blabbering which led to her demise. She knew too much about Jack's business affairs and, more importantly, the business affairs of his associates, and she was found with a bullet to her left temple at 1641 Ocean Avenue in Brooklyn on July the 1st, 1933, just 18 months after Jack had expired. She had been dead for 2 days when the building superintendent found her body. She was shot by gunmen to silence her, but it seems that she knew her assailants. At the crime scene, there were 3 cups of coffee on her kitchen table, indicating that she had welcomed in her callers. Apparently, when police found her, an expression of disbelief and fear was still frozen on her face. Alice was buried in an unmarked grave next to her husband, Jack. As is the norm in this way of life, Jack's potential business partner, Mad Dog Col, also met a gruesome death. Completely exiled from the underworld and with his gang either dead or in jail, Col was approached by Jack's old pal Oni Madden, who told Col he could arrange a peace deal between the Mad Dog and Dutch Schultz, to which Mad Dog lapped up. Whilst hiding from police at his new headquarters, the Cornish Arms Hotel, on February the 8th, 1932, Cole ventured to the nearby London Chemist drugstore to call Oni and get the time and location for the peace meeting, which was due to take place the next day. Keeping Col on the phone long enough and obtaining his location, Oni alerted Schultz, who sent Bo Weinberg and 2 other Schultz hitmen to the chemists, where they lit him up in the telephone booth, pumping a whole round of a Thompson submachine gun into the baby killer, killing him instantly. He was just 23 years old. Bo Weinberg, now the main man behind the slayings of 2 of his boss's enemies, didn't receive much gratitude from Dutch Schultz. While Schultz was in jail awaiting a tax evasion charge, Bo Weinberg was conspiring with fellow gangsters to take over Schultz's bootlegging operation in New York. Ultimately, Schultz found out, and the Dutchman concreted Bo Weinberg's feet in a bucket of cement and tossed him into the East River. As for Dutch Schultz, he would meet his fate 4 years after Jack in 1935. Whilst exiled from New York by the now Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia, Schultz and his gang were murdered on orders of Jack's old pal Lucky Luciano, who was now head of the commission in the Big Apple. Dutch was hit with 3 bullets at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, and he died the next day. Diamond gang members Jerry Scaccio and John Dalton moved to Detroit to avoid any Manhattan underworld skeletons catching up with them and began running with the infamous Purple Gang. Little is known about the duo after this, but it's believed that they spent their years in Detroit. Thus brings an end to the colourful life of Jack Legs Diamond, a man who seemed to be invincible and rose from the slums of Philadelphia to run Manhattan's underworld and became, during the early 1930s, the most famous gangster in New York. Thanks so much for watching. Please like the video and consider subscribing if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.